Hello, this is Dr. Keith Miller, and as this particular presentation on climate change is going to focus on how do we reconstruct climates of the past? What evidence do we use to infer what the climate has been through the Pleistocene back millions of years, back through all of Earth history? And there are techniques to do that. And the particular evidences that we use from the geologic record to reconstruct past climates are called proxies. So this particular talk is going to look at understanding a few of those proxies that are commonly used to reconstruct past climates. So first place to look is the sedimentary rock record. Um, So sedimentary rocks are deposited under particular environmental settings. And those environments of deposition, reflect the deposits from those reflect those environments. They reflect and climate is important part of those environments. So we'll be looking at a number of examples, but I list some up here. Look at soils, coal beds, desert sandstones, evaporates, glacial deposits, marine limestones, et cetera, et cetera. Each of those has particular climate implications. And the other thing we'll look at next after that is the fossil record. And different fossil species and fossil communities are also indicative of certain past climates, certain conditions that are related to climate. So here are just a couple of examples of sedimentary rock deposits. On the left, we have a coal bed. Obviously, coals are deposited under a wet climate in which you have marshes or swamps that are anoxic and preserve the vegetation and the organic material that falls into those environments. And those are we received as coal beds, for example. On the upper right-hand corner, we have aeolian sand dunes or desert sand dunes. And these have very distinctive features, what we call sedimentary structures that are indicative of those particular environments. In this case, wind-blown sand dunes. In this case, their sand dunes would be similar to the large sand dune seas we call ergs, for example, in the Sahara Desert today. And then in the lower right-hand corner are glacial deposits. These are glacial tills. These are sediments that are carried by ice, transported by ice, and deposited by ice. And they are very characteristic. They are unsorted. That means they have everything from boulders to very, very fine silt, all mixed up very chaotically. And it's a very distinctive type of sedimentary deposit. Lakes are a very good source of climatic information. Many lakes, long-lived lakes, have what are called VARs, which are annual beds or laminations. And these reflect seasonal changes in organic productivity, in influx of sediments from outside of the lake. And they also have very significant climate implications. One of the most famous varved sequences is the Green River Formation out west, which covers a very large area and it's extremely thick. Records millions of years of climatic history. And the character of these little pairs or couplets of sediment that you see in VARs tell a lot about the general environment. You can have VARs formed in periglacial environments, so glacial lakes, where you have influx of coarser sediments in the spring melt. And then during the winter, when they're iced over, the fine materials settle out. So you get these coarse, fine gradations. Or as in the lower left-hand corner, you have ones that alternate between highly organic rich layers to silty layers. And again, this has to do with sediment influx and also seasonal variations in organic productivity in those lakes. And there are a wide variety of other types of lakes as well, all of which give some climatic information. Fossil soils or paleosols are a very good indicator of general climatic conditions. I just show three different types of paleosols. There's many, many different types of paleosols, which are distinctive by their color, by their structures, by their chemical content. So we have in the lower left what's called a lateritic soil. These are typically red, as these are highly oxidized, and they form in tropical wet environments. So it's a very warm environment and a very wet environment to generate these characteristic, very thick soils that are produced in tropical environments, so ever wet environments. In the upper right-hand corner, we have what's called a calcic soil. And the light colors there are calcium carbonate nodules, which form in a semi-arid kind of environment. Also very seasonal, so a dry season and then a wetter season. And the calcium carbonate precipitates out during the drier times. And the lower right hand is called a vertic soil. These have very diagnostic colors. And also, if you look at the photo there, kind of an undulatory surface. And these form in a very monsoonal, wet, dry kind of climate, where the soils expand and contract as the clays in the soil soak up water during the wet season and then dry out in the dry season. So the soil is expanding and contracting. It gets thrown up into these undulatory surfaces. Again, very diagnostic. And those soils can also contain paleontological evidence of some of the life that lived in those various soils. Here are just a few examples. And these also can have climatic significance. For example, crayfish burrows. These are crayfish that burrow in floodplain, river floodplain sediments. And they will burrow down from the surface down to the water table. They need to be in someplace where they can be in a wet setting and get below the water table. So the length of the burrows is diagnostic of how deep the water table was in that particular environment. And the right hand are lungfish burrows. Lungfish burrows indicate a very seasonal environment in which lakes are temporary, they're ephemeral. So during an extended dry season, or maybe for a couple of years, the wet season is missed. And what the lungfish do is they burrow down into the sediment. It's called estivation. They create kind of a sheath around them to protect them. And they can remain that way for a couple of years. And then if it gets wet, then they come back out of their burrows and have another generation. These are small type of lungfish. And all those burrows you see are burrows made by these lungfish. In fact, these burrows actually contain lungfish bones. And you then can stack both different types of sedimentary rocks and different types of soils. And that can give a record of changes in climate over time and also changes in sea level. This is from the Kansas early Permian. The light colored, more resistant layers there are limestones. They were formed in a shallow sea. And the colorful layers are from paleosols, these fossil soils. And again, as we talked about, those different colors and patterns and characteristics of those soils indicate different climatic environments. So again, the red ones there are calcic soils. The gray ones are vertic soils from monsoonal environments. The dark grayish ones at the bottom are from a wetter environment. So again, you get now a vertical sequence. You see not only alterations between terrestrial and marine conditions, but changes in climate as those sea level changes occur. Plant fossils. Plants are very good indicators of general climatic conditions. So where plant fossils are available, it's another piece of evidence that can be used to piece together past climates based on the species of fossil plants present. In the upper right-hand corner, sometimes you don't, it's actually the morphology of the leaves that can be indicative. For example, if you have leaves that have a smooth margin, those are usually in wetter environments, because smooth margins on leaves can shed water more effectively. Those in drier climates have notched or edged margins to their leaves. So just again, a very broad environmental indicator. Below that is a micrograph of tree rings. And tree rings are very useful. Again, they're an annual for trees that are in seasonal environments. You have these annual tree rings. Each tree ring is a year. And the width of different parts of those rings, see parts of the rings where the cells are large, parts of the ring where they're close together. So generally in the spring is when the tree is growing more quickly, so it has larger cells. And then as it starts to go into senescence during the winter, the individual cells get smaller again. And then there's abrupt change with the next spring. But it tells us how seasonal it is. The width of the cells of the rings tells something about the conditions, how favorable the conditions were for growth. So it has to do with moisture and temperature and other factors. And then on the left are spores. Very often, you don't have macrofossils of plant leaves and plant material. But what you have is spores. Spores are much more easily preserved than whole leaves or branches or stems and things like that. And they can also be really well preserved in things like lakes. So again, those spores can be identified with particular plant species, and those plant species can tell us something about climate. To turn to the ocean, planktonic microfossils are also very helpful in reconstructing climatic conditions or environmental conditions within the oceans. So at the bottom, we have coccoliths. They're what form, for example, on the left, the chalk cliffs of Dover. So these are calcareous fossils, and they indicate high productivity. And so the ocean is very productive. So because the coccoliths are planktonic phytoplankton, so they're at the base of the food chain. So that gives you something of how productive the ecosystem was. At the top are radiolarians. They're siliceous rather than calcareous. And they're found in the deep, they end up deposited in the deep ocean as they rain out of the water and sink to the bottom. And those form cherts. And again, they can also give us environmental information, different species, indicative of different ocean environments. Again, on the upper right hand, there is a variety of forams or foraminiferans. Again, these are temperature sensitive. So different species live in different temperature regimes. They're also depth dependent. Some are shallow, some are deep water, some are benthic, which means they live in the sediments. So they give you some idea of the conditions within different layers within the ocean, from the seafloor up through the water column. Lower right are ostracodes. Again, they are sensitive to temperature. They're sensitive to salinities. And again, tell us something about the environments in which they lived. And then on the left-hand side, these are organic rich marine sediments. This is very significant because in order to get very organic rich dark muds like this in the ocean, the bottom of the ocean has to be very low in oxygen. And the sediment below the ocean has to be basically anoxic. And this tells you a lot about the oceanography of the time. There are certain times in Earth history where the bottom of the oceans, of the deep oceans, went to anoxic. And that tells you something about ocean circulation. You're not getting vertical circulation, not getting oxygen circulated down into the ocean bottom. And those are very significant climate indicators. Also, coral reefs, just reef systems in general, which have existed throughout much of Earth history, although the species that make up those reefs have changed dramatically in different times of Earth history. But reef deposits in general are also very sensitive to temperature. They also, for what are called hermatypic corals, have to be in the photic zone. So they have to be shallow enough to be able to receive sunlight through the water. Also fairly turbulent waters that are pretty productive as far as plankton are concerned. And they're very temperature sensitive. Modern coral reefs are very temperature sensitive. In fact, they're being threatened now by the rate of ocean warming. Because in very warm climates, very warm temperatures are very source of significant stress for modern coral reef systems. One very interesting type of evidence are called oxygen isotopes, stable isotopes. Probably are aware that many elements come in isotopes. That is, they have the same number of protons, which define the element, but they have different number of protons. And that, so these different isotopes are, as they appear in the ocean water, and as they're taken up by ocean living organisms to form calcareous skeletons or shells, the oxygen that's incorporated in that calcium carbonate in the shells, that oxygen is taken out of the water, and the water at a given time in the ocean has a certain ratio of oxygen isotopes. And as we'll see a little bit later, these isotopes are also preserved in ice cores that can go back 800,000 years or more. So here's an example of oxygen isotope record from foraminiferans. So these small planktonic shells have a certain ratio of oxygen isotopes in their shells, and that is sensitive to temperature and to um, relative ocean depth. Well, how does that work? I can briefly explain. Um, Again, we have O18 and O16. They're two isotopes. O18 is heavier than O16 because it has extra neutrons, which makes it heavier. And if you evaporate water from the oceans, it's the water with the lighter oxygen isotope that's going to be preferentially evaporated, which means the water that's evaporated in the atmosphere is going to be lighter than the ocean. And the more you evaporate from the ocean, the heavier the ocean water gets, more increasing percentage of oxygen 18, of the heavy water, oxygen 18 in the water. So that means that during cold times when ice is forming, so the water is evaporated from the oceans, it gets carried over continents, it gets rained out as snow. That snow falls and accumulates in ice, which doesn't flow back into the oceans. So it's preferentially taking out light oxygen out of the oceans, which means the oceans get heavier. The ocean water gets heavier. And that's actually what you're seeing in this illustration. The warmest time in this record is called the Paleoeocene thermal maximum. And that's when that curve is furthest to the right. So the water is the warmest. In other words, at this point, the water is the lightest. It has more oxygen 16. As the globe cooled off and then dramatically cooled off during the Pleistocene, which is at the top of that graph, now lots of water is being removed from the ocean. That's light water. It gets snowed out into glaciers, and the remaining oceans get very heavy. And so we can both see temperature and sea level by looking at these isotope records. Isotope records, actually, you can record them on a yearly basis. These are growth bands within a clamshell, again, also preserving the isotope record. And now you're getting seasonal changes. You're seeing any variations in the seasons from year to year. And some of these shells can have records that extend 100 years. So you can get a 100-year record of seasonal changes over that time. One of the most interesting sources of climate data are from ice cores. So if you drill an ice core, whether it's Antarctica or Greenland ice sheet or elsewhere, you drill out a core of ice, you'll find that that ice is filled with air bubbles. And those air bubbles were trapped in the ice as that ice solidified out of the snow that fell. So the snow gradually gets compacted, the air gets kind of squeezed out of the snow kind of melts and refreezes, and eventually it forms solid ice. And in the process, it's trapping air bubbles from the time at which it formed that solid ice. And ice is a really good protector, seals those gas bubbles so that the gas doesn't leak out. And so those air bubbles. So you can then go back in looking at ice cores that have been drilled out from, again, mostly Greenland, Antarctica, as well as some other places, know their depth. There's also indicators from ash falls and other things that can tell you how old the ice is. And then knowing the age of that ice, stick a needle into that ice bubble, pull that air out and analyze it, and you can reconstruct what the concentrations of the various gases in the atmosphere are, how much CO2 there is, how much methane there was in those air bubbles. And you can also get isotopic data as well. And then from that, you can generate curves like this. So this is the last 400,000 years. And all those curves are created from those ice bubbles. So you have CO2 concentrations, methane concentrations, and then a reconstructed temperature. And so this is very valuable through the Pleistocene, where we have ice core records. So in conclusion, there's a wide range of climate proxies that enable us to reconstruct past regional and global climates. And I've just touched on a few. There are many, many different types of proxies. And you don't just use one proxy, usually multiple proxies to work out a climate at a given time in Earth history. So you have all these different pieces of evidence that you pull together and allows you to reconstruct climates out of particular, both general global climates and also regional climates. So you know how the climates varied, say, across what's now the North American continent. How were climate conditions different in different parts of that continental area? You can also use them not only for terrestrial environments, but you can look at marine conditions, as we've talked about, oxygen content, productivity, ocean circulation, things like that. So this is another one of my contributions to this series on climate change. If this has interested you, I encourage you to go to my climate change playlist on my YouTube channel and view the other videos that are a part of this climate change playlist.